As leaders, it is our responsibility to rise above the resistance and work towards collective liberation. I love that word, collective liberation. This important discussion that we're going to have right now features 3 distinguished members of the Kellogg Foundation. Remember I told you that SCORE word? They're from SCORE. So I'll say it one more time today, and then for the rest of the week, I'll just call them SCORE. So it's Solidarity Council on Racial Equity. The SCORE members have joined their powerful voices together in solidarity to reach beyond familiar circles, with opportunities to unite in common purpose and create a platform for collective action and to work in solidarity to advance racial equity. Please help me welcome the panel that's coming on stage. Give them a round of applause as they make their way to stage.
Good morning. My name is Kent Wong. I'm a member of the Solidarity Council on Racial Equity, and I will be joined by my 3 colleagues in just a few minutes. I wanted to start, however, by talking about my first journey here to South Africa 31 years ago. This was a very special trip for me. I've had a 30-year-plus relationship with the Kellogg Foundation. And as a Kellogg Fellow, I was given the opportunity to come to South Africa. This had been a dream of mine for many years. When I was a student activist at the University of California at Berkeley, I was involved in the movement to support the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And we organized nationally to demand that our universities and colleges divest from multinational corporations who were propping up the apartheid regime in South Africa. And through my activism, we hosted a delegation of leaders of Soweto. And everywhere they spoke, they inspired students in the United States to join in solidarity with their struggle against apartheid and for racial and economic justice. And so I was very excited to be able to come to South Africa back in 1992, at a time when Nelson Mandela still was behind bars, at a time when change was in the air, and everybody knew that apartheid was in its dying gasps. But unfortunately, this was also a time of tremendous anxiety and violence and fear of what was to become. And so we met with extraordinary leaders in South Africa. We met with Walter Sisulu and the leaders of the African National Congress. We met with Sister Ann Hope, a popular educator who worked with Stephen Biko to find the power of organizing in the townships. We met with anti-apartheid members of parliament such as Jan van Eck. And on one fateful evening in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa, which haunts me to this day, we met with a young brother named Skhumbuzo Ngwenya, who was a leader of the African National Congress and the United Democratic Front. And he came out to meet with a group of 15 Kellogg Fellows to share the stories of the struggle against apartheid. And he spoke with passion and with conviction. And I was so inspired by his stories. A minute after he left us at the dinner table, we heard shots ring out. And he was assassinated minutes after he left us. We had 2 physicians who were Kellogg Fellows who cared for him as he died. And the very next day, we visited his widow and his children because we wanted to let them know how his final minutes on earth were spent. And already they were preparing for his funeral because under apartheid South Africa, a funeral was one of the few opportunities where the people could come together and mourn and grieve, but also to organize and to mobilize and to honor those who have gone before them, to carry on the struggle. And so to this day, 31 years later, I think of Skhumbuzo, I think of the thousands of martyrs here in South Africa who laid down their lives for a free and democratic South Africa. And we met with Judge Goldstone during our trip, and we talked about Skhumbuzo and his work, and we documented his assassination. And we went on a speaking tour and held press conferences to denounce the apartheid-inspired violence in South Africa as they knew their days were coming to an end. And 2 years later, in 1994, the world rejoiced with the freedom of Nelson Mandela and an end to the brutal apartheid regime. Months after I returned from South Africa, my hometown of Los Angeles, California, experienced one of the worst civil unrest disturbances in decades, when a group of white police officers were acquitted after the internationally televised videotaping of the beating of Rodney King. And my city of Los Angeles erupted in flames, flames of anger, flames of dreams deferred and promises unkept. And I thought deeply about my time in South Africa and how many similarities we see between systems of oppression and white supremacy and anti-blackness, about similarities we see about the role of the criminal justice system, which has brutalized people of color and led to mass incarceration, between a system that has institutionalized racial and economic injustice for generations. And so when we stand in solidarity with the people of South Africa, it is not because we feel sorry for them. It is not because we are in a privileged position, which we are. It is because through our solidarity is strength, and indeed our struggles are integrally united together. I'll share one last story before I bring up my friends from the Solidarity Council on Racial Equity. My good friend Karen Bass is now the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, the second largest city in the United States. We both went to high school together in public schools in Los Angeles. I've known her for close to 40 years. I first met Karen Bass when she was chair of the Free South Africa Committee. And as a young black woman living in Los Angeles, she deeply identified with the struggle of the people of South Africa. They gave her hope and inspiration. After the 1992 civil unrest, she built the Community Coalition to advance racial and economic justice in Los Angeles in the aftermath of the burnings that took place. She went on to become the first black woman to become Speaker of the California Assembly. She went on to Congress, and she was chair of the Black Congressional Caucus and led members of the Black Congressional Caucus here to Africa to express solidarity in her new role as the leader of the Black Congressional Caucus. And in November of last year, she was elected the first woman mayor in the 241-year history of Los Angeles and the first black woman mayor in the history of our city. So when I think of Karen Bass, I think of people who have been deeply inspired by the liberation movement of South Africa, who understand that the struggle of the people of South Africa is our struggle as well. And so when I call up my friends from the Solidarity Council on Racial Equity, this is the spirit that we want to advance, that we have a special opportunity. 200 leaders from 25 countries who can dream and envision a future with racial justice and racial healing. And so joining me on the stage today is my good friend, John Powell, a leader of the Institute for Otherness and Belonging at the University of California, Berkeley, where he teaches law African American Studies and Ethnic Studies, and has personally advised leaders of the governments of South Africa and Mozambique. My good friend Linda Sarsour, a Palestinian Muslim American who was one of the co-chairs of the Women's March in the United States, called shortly after the election of the white supremacist Donald Trump, and has been named by Time magazine as the top 100 most influential people in the world. And finally, my friend, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, a leading advocate mobilizing faith-based communities throughout the United States for racial and economic justice, and he was named by Newsweek magazine as one of the top rabbis in the United States. Welcome, Jonah Pesner. So this will be a conversation with a representation of some of the leaders of the Solidarity Council on Racial Equity who are meeting with all of us over the course of the next few days. And we sincerely hope that in the coming days that we can work together, to plan together, to strategize together, and to work together to envision a world filled with peace and justice. And so I wanted to lead off with my good friend John Powell. If you could tell me about your own connection with South Africa and how you see the broader link between the struggle against apartheid and the struggle for black liberation in the United States.
Well, thank you, Kent, and thank you, Kellogg, and thank you, Lejeune. Many of you know that Lejeune is not only the president and CEO of Kellogg, you also know she's a great dancer, and you also know she's a Detroit homegirl. I say that because I'm a Detroit homeboy. So I came to Africa in the early 70s. I had a postgraduate work, and I lived in Tanzania. And Tanzania was home of the frontline states, and those were states working to try to liberate South Africa and then Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe. And so I traveled around with a very famous activist named Bill Sutherland, lived with him for a number of years. Got to know a number of people, including Justice Albie Sachs. That was before he was Justice, and it was before the bomb that took one of his arms. My daughter was born in Tanzania, so the work with South Africa was very deep. And a lot of people say that there wouldn't be a Nelson Mandela if there had not been a Julius Nyerere. And I got to know Julius Nyerere personally, went to his house and drank wine out of jelly jars, and he was the real deal. And the way Tanzania and the frontline states organized themselves for the liberation of South Africa and Rhodesia was phenomenal, because all these countries were struggling. Years later, I went to South Africa before apartheid ended, and we have limited time, so I'm not going to try to give you the whole story, but I will say this. I did work in South Africa for the South African government. After apartheid ended, I was invited to help structure the new educational program in South Africa, which they adopted 80% of what I suggested. I went back to the United States, and after they adopted, they said, we want you to come to South Africa, and we want to recognize you. And having lived in Africa and worked in South Africa, I realized it was more than just ceremonial. It had deep meaning. But all of you who just flew over and realized that long-ass flight, it's like, I said, thank you, but no thank you. I'm not flying back to South Africa. It's too much. They said, we need you here. And I said, I appreciate your recognition, but I'm staying in the United States. There's a pause. And I said, what if we could arrange a private dinner with you and Nelson Mandela? I said, okay, I'm on my way. Since then, I've worked in South Africa and Africa generally, and I could go on, but I think South Africa is critical, not just to South Africa, but not just to Africa, but really to the world. And it's not surprising that Nelson Mandela became the figure that he did, even though today he's somewhat controversial in South Africa. And I end just saying two things. So when I was trying to recover from jet lag, I was having breakfast, being lost, and Sarsour and I sat and had breakfast together. And I said, one of the nicest things about coming and being part of the Solidarity Council is I get to hang out with Sarsour in South Africa, even though we live together in the Bay Area. And then before we come up here, Linda was noting how old I am, and she said, it's too bad we sort of missed out on those really monumentous events that people your generation got to experience. And I said, Linda, your generation, you are creating new events, and I'm enjoying them, and I wish I could stay around longer to see what you're going to do to this world. So thank you.
Thank you, John Powell. Linda, as one of the leaders of the Women's March in the United States, you have emerged as an activist who represents both the movement for racial justice and women's equality. What do you see as the importance of linking racial justice and gender justice?
So first of all, I want to say thank you for having me here. I feel very blessed and honored to be in the space. And I would be remiss not to say that as a Palestinian American, I feel deeply humbled and honored and inspired to be here in South Africa. I have had the privilege to travel the world, and while I know there are solidarity movements with Palestinians in every country in the world, it is rare that you come to a country where the government itself is in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and that is due to the people of South Africa. So thank you for your solidarity. I see a direct link, and there is a quote by a famous poet and writer, Audre Lorde, that says, "We cannot have single-issue struggles because we do not live single-issue lives." So there is no way to have a racial justice movement by itself, or a gender justice movement by itself, or a climate justice movement by itself. All of these movements, all of these rights are intertwined because we are people who have multiple identities and intersecting identities. So before people were talking intersectionality in this recent movement, meaning in the post-Donald Trump time, intersectionality was a word given to us by a Black woman named Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And I lived intersectionality way before people were talking about it or naming conferences after it. So we cannot invoke gender justice or push for the rights of women if we are not pushing for the rights of Black women and Indigenous women and Latina women and women all over the world, including Palestinian women. And that's this philosophy in which I organize from. And as a Palestinian American organizing within the United States of America, I happen to be Palestinian. And that just happens to be where my family is from and where my parents and grandparents were born. But I believe that in America, when Black people are free, everybody's going to be free. And that is the movement that I have dedicated the last 2 decades of my life to.
Thank you so much, Linda. Jonah, there's been a strong faith-based component to the movement for liberation in South Africa, from the role of Bishop Desmond Tutu to religious leaders internationally who have stepped forward to support the people of South Africa. What is your view of the role of faith-based organizations in the struggle for liberation?
Thank you, Kent. And let me, as a faith leader, a clergy person on the panel, in the spirit of Kevin's wonderful frame for the day, just offer gratitude in the authentic words of my tradition. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehachianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, the source of all life, who has breathed life into us, who has kept us alive, and enabled us to reach this sacred moment of gathering, which, as Lejeune said earlier, has been a long time in coming. So it's really an honor to be back in Johannesburg and to invoke the name Bishop Desmond Tutu, who not only came to Grand Rapids to speak to the Kellogg Foundation, but he came to my office as the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, the largest and most diverse denomination in Jewish life, to speak to us and acknowledge our historic role in the civil rights movement in the United States. People may remember the iconic picture of Dr. King marching with my predecessor, Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, holding a Torah scroll, and of course the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who famously, when he came back from the march in Selma and was criticized by some in the Jewish community who said, how could you have not observed the Sabbath day? How could you have been out activating instead of praying? He said, I was praying with my feet. The solidarity vision that we share, for me as a religious person, in deep solidarity with my Muslim, my Christian, my Baha'i, my Hindu, my people of all faiths, and frankly, people of belief differently, humanistic faiths, that we actually can be part of that liberatory vision that you described, which for me, as a Jewish person, knowing that all social movements are ultimately faith-based movements, the first social movement was when my people overcame the shackles of Egyptian slavery, when we were enslaved by Pharaoh, and we tell this ancient master narrative, which incredibly says we were able to rise up out of Egyptian bondage and become a free people, but that 36 different times, 36 different ways, God says in the Torah, the Bible, my tradition, you were enslaved in Egypt, and therefore you are to love the stranger. 36 different times in the Bible, we are commanded as Jews, because we experienced oppression, we were enslaved, we are not to tolerate, we are not to put up with, we are not to be accepting of, we are to love the stranger. And Dr. King talked about the beloved community. So for me, it's a faith-based movement because it teaches both the moral claim that we have all potentially known oppression and therefore must liberate all people. Number two, we have to have faith that wherever there is oppression, there can be another way. And then finally, we have to organize our power. Because in our churches, and our synagogues, and our mosques, and other gathering places, that's where we have the political power to build the political will to transform the world as it is, which is parched with oppression, into the world as it could be, one overflowing for justice for all people.
Thank you, Rabbi Jonah. John, you mentioned that at the time that Lejeune first brought us all together as the Solidarity Council on Racial Equity, this was before the pandemic, this was before the movement for Black Lives, and before a new movement of young activists took to the streets to demand racial justice and economic justice. And so I was interested in your thoughts on the power of the movement for Black Lives in the US following the police killing of George Floyd and countless other black men and women, and how might the movement for Black Lives learn from and stand in solidarity with those who have successfully dismantled apartheid through the Truth and Reconciliation process in building a free and democratic South Africa. So how do you look at this relationship and this link?
It's actually complicated. Bishop Tutu and Alexander in constructing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was controversial. There were some South Africans that opposed it. And I'm close enough to South Africa to realize that for many, especially young South Africans, they feel like the movement to dismantle apartheid is only half done. And what we're seeing is something really quite complicated. We're seeing a reemergence of ethnic and tribal difference within Black South Africans, which is actually a very important lesson. Let's sort of notice how identities shift. Steve Biko, I was in Africa working when Steve Biko was killed. And Steve Biko, for those of you who don't know him, he was actually head of what was called the Black Consciousness Movement. And it was important because South Africa was really a country of several different tribes. And what he was saying is that what transcends your tribal difference is your racial difference. And so he was actually pushing Black consciousness. When the apparent victory of ending of apartheid, the reemergence of tribal difference is actually starting to occur. And we're actually happening right now in South Africa. That's the lesson that we need to learn. Linda spoke about identities. We have multiple identities, but they're constantly shifting. And we play a role in terms of how they shift. So I live in California, as you do, Kent. And as you know, there's an issue now about reparation. And one of the big issues is who is Black for the purpose of reparation? And it turns out to be a very hard, but also a very divisive issue. So we can't just assume our racial or our political identities are there. We have to participate in making them real. And part of that participation is that they not get locked in some narrow categorical identity in the way that Linda was talking about. We have to carry multiple identities. And again, time is short, so I'm just going to say this. How do we create and maintain our identities in such a way that everyone, every group gets to belong, as opposed to our group belong and your group does not belong? How do we create a world where our identities support who we are, but who we're not? And I think that's a struggle right now in the United States, as we sort of bend under the weight of white supremacy. Can we actually maintain an open, embracing, a loving identity that's pluralistic and recognize other people's suffering as well? So it seems to me South Africa is struggling with that, and I think the United States is struggling with it as well.
Thank you, John Powell. Linda, as a Palestinian woman, there are parallels between the struggle of Palestinians against occupation and oppression and those of the black majority under apartheid South Africa. What do you think the Palestinian people could learn from, and what could they teach the people of South Africa?
Thank you, Kent. I want to acknowledge that a lot of us are in different places. Dr. John Powell has been around a long time and has lived a very purposeful life and is in the space of thinking about things in different ways than I think, because I'm on the front line. So I just want to acknowledge that I have a hard time, I think, and I understand young people who are struggling with this world where we could all exist together, especially if you are folks who are survivors of racial violence, if you are someone who lives in a country that is oppressing you. It's hard to envision that world where we could live with our oppressors in ways that are loving and open. And I think that's why I am so honored to be in space with Dr. John Powell, because he allows me and challenges me in the way that I think about how I organize and the ways in which I speak about the issues that I organize on. You know, South Africa has everything to teach Palestine. You have the resilience, the commitment, you have the sacrifice. And what a lot of people don't want to acknowledge, that is, in order to get to liberation, you must sacrifice. Sacrifice your careers, sacrifice your life, sacrifice everything that you hold dear to you. And that is what South Africa teaches the Palestinian people. There are so many parallels to what the Palestinian people experience in Palestine. And there's really not much that we Palestinians can teach the South African people, but I think we could teach the world together is joy. That even amidst apartheid and occupation, we still get married. We still have joy. We still know how to dance. We still have music. I went to Palestine last summer, and my people are an incredibly resilient and beautiful people. I felt so much unique and just pure joy amongst the people that you would think would not be able to experience that. And that's what the South African people and the Palestinian people can teach the world. I say to people all the time that we could talk about liberation, but we also have to see how liberation has experienced. There will be bloodshed. There will be people who will lose their jobs. There will be people who will lose those that they love. There will be people who will be marginalized from the marginalized because of standing up for what is right and standing up for the most marginalized people. And there got to be people that are willing to do that. There are people that have to be willing to sacrifice for racial equity, because there has never been a time that anyone has won even a little bit of freedom anywhere without that type of deep sacrifice and standing on principles and standing on conviction. So I thank the South African people for continuing to be a light for my people in Palestine, for Palestinians in the United States, as we live in a government that does not show solidarity with the Palestinian people. In fact, my government funds occupation of the Palestinian people. So I love you, South Africa. I'm so deeply honored and humbled and emotional to be here with all of you. So thank you for teaching me, and thank you for being an inspiration to my people.
Our time is coming to a close, so I will ask one last question of Rabbi Jonah. The struggle for racial equity in the U.S. is highly polarized. The right-wing dominated U.S. Supreme Court is attacking affirmative action, voting rights, ethnic studies, and other gains that were secured by the civil rights movement. What could SCORE and Kellogg do to advance an agenda for racial justice in the face of these attacks?
Well, what it feels like, and I talked a moment ago about the faith-based social justice movement that many of us are part of, there is another way that faith gets co-opted and misused. And there is a paradigm of white Christian nationalism in the United States right now that is showing up in everything from Supreme Court cases to policies that are being passed across states, across the United States, around don't say gay bills, trans bans, all kinds of assaults on women's rights to control their bodies. And I think what SCORE can uniquely do is build the interfaith, multiracial relationships that could actually build the kind of collective power to make the United States be the multi-faith, multiracial, inclusive democracy, where if every voice was heard because every vote would counted, then all people would actually be liberated. I want to say the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was written in our conference room at the Religious Action Center Reform Judaism. So it is personal to us that was eviscerated by the Supreme Court. And though I appreciate Justice Cameron earlier, who acknowledged Justice Roberts for having one good ruling in Alabama to protect voting rights, across the last decade, voting rights in the United States have been eviscerated. We are becoming an even more undemocratic nation. I also want to say, in just lifting up what Linda Sarsour said, as a Jew and as a rabbi, I am deeply committed to the Palestinian people's right to their national aspirations, to the human and civil rights of Palestinian people. Just as a Zionist, I'm committed to the right and the responsibility of the Jewish people to live freely in their lands. One thing that the Solidarity Council can do is lay out a vision in which all people can thrive. The Jewish people can thrive in their historic homeland. The Palestinian people can thrive in their historic homeland. The people of South Africa can thrive in their country. And all people everywhere can be liberated because, frankly, our safety as humans will come in our solidarity with one another. And potentially, we can redeem the souls of our nations through an inclusive, multiracial democracy that actually empowers every human to have their voice be heard.
Ken, before we end,
please, John.
Just one thing, two things really. Well, one, I think we're not just talking about racial justice, we're also talking about belonging. But a critical piece of what we're talking about is healing.
Yes.
And we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge Gail Christopher, who really brought this concept into the public discourse into Kellogg.
Thanks very much. Let's give a hand to our panelists, John Powell, Linda Sarsour, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, and we very much hope that the conversation that we initiated this morning will continue in the coming hours and the coming days. And together we will emerge from a unified vision of peace and justice for the months and years to come. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask the panelists to please stay on stage. We do have some time, so we can take 2 questions. We don't want to miss this opportunity. There we go. We've got a question here. Is there anybody else? There we go. Okay, great. Just give me 2 minutes.
Hi, my name is Firdaus Bobolia. I'm from South Africa. Viva Palestine, viva! I just went to Palestine this past Ramadan, and it has been the most amazing experience. And I want to say to you, as I want to ask the rabbi, how do we talk about a free Palestine, given the conditions and knowing what's happening? I sit here and I cringe a little bit because I'm wondering how that will be done. Thank you.
Do you want to go first?
So, Assalamu alaikum, sister. So I appreciate you asking that question. And I know that this Global Leadership Forum is not about Palestine, Israel, but I think it's an interesting conversation that needs to be had, especially within the United States of America. It is one of the most divisive issues when it comes to the ways in which we organize in the United States. And my belief is very clear, and I'm going to put it forth here, and I believe this about every issue that I organize around, that you cannot fight for safety and security for your own group at the expense of another group. And that's what I believe about Palestine. Once we get to a conversation about, even in the United States, white and black, migrant versus indigenous, or migrant versus American citizens, we cannot ever be in a space where we say, free anybody at the expense of somebody else. And I think that once we fundamentally agree that in Palestine, that we cannot have one group that is free at the expense of another group, or safety and sanctuary for the Jewish people in which they deserve at the expense of the Palestinian people, then we will live in a harmonious world. We could find justice and we can find peace. And I love this concept of peace, and I know people like to use that all the time. They always say things like Islam is a religion of peace. I don't believe that. I believe that you cannot have peace without justice. And I think that that is the movement that I'm committed to, not just as a Palestinian, but as an American, as a woman, as a Muslim. And so that's the foundation that I want to start from. Can you see yourself with safety and security at my expense and the expense of my grandparents and my great-grandparents?
I appreciate what Linda just said, and I second the safety and the thriving of any one community can't come at the expense of another community, whether that's the Jewish community living in its ancestral homeland in Israel or the Palestinian community. And right now, this two-state solution feels like it's on life support. But I am deeply, deeply committed, as is the Reform Jewish movement, which is the largest and most diverse denomination in Jewish life, to the two-state solution, because it gives us a vision of what it would actually be like for Palestinian national aspirations and Jewish national aspirations to live in the world as it is, which is a world with borders and nation states and the rest, as imperfect and as challenging as it is. And I would invite one other piece. We criticize, my movement criticizes the policies of the state of Israel all the time. And you can Google me and you'll see. I'm not very popular with the Israeli government. We protest, we march, we advocate, and we organize. But we never question the legitimacy of the Jewish state. For 3,000 years, the Jewish people have had a connection to the historic land of Israel. And for 2,000 years, we lived in a series of dislocations, migrations, genocides, whether it was the pogroms of Europe that forced my grandparents to come to the United States, or forced some of the great white Jewish heroes of South Africa to come from the European pogroms to South Africa, to then become leaders of the resistance movement to apartheid, or the other dislocations. There has always been a Jewish presence in the land of Israel, as there has been a presence of Palestinian people. The only way we're going to be able to move forward is to find a way to lay out what Linda said, which is people's finding their safety and their security, not at the expense of the other, but potentially with the joy and the humanity of the other. I started by saying the number one command of the Torah, my tradition, is don't put up with a stranger, don't be tolerant of the stranger, love the stranger. So I spent a lot of time in Palestine and I spent a lot of time in Israel trying to do the kind of grassroots peace-building work where people will love the other. By the way, one last thing I just have to say, because we're going to be meeting with Judge Albie Sachs later today and tomorrow. Judge Sachs is the example of the white, and by the way, Jews are black, they're brown, they're Latino, they are Asian. Jews come in all hues. They don't all look like me. But there was a pattern of migration because of persecution from Europe to South Africa and other places like the United States. Albie Sachs is a refugee from Europe, comes here, discovers his whiteness, right? Didn't realize, because of thousands of years of persecution of Jews, suddenly he benefits from white privilege. And what does he do with that privilege? He winds up becoming an activist within the ANC, is targeted by the regime, and has the side of his body, as John Powell said earlier, blown off by the regime, ultimately comes and builds the Supreme Court, writes the Constitution. I invoke the name of Helen Zuzman, who was the one member of the parliament from 1959 for 13 years, so do the math, 1972, who was the lone opponent to apartheid in South Africa. And why? Because she was a Jew. And she was a victim of misogyny and of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish bigotry, but she understood that 2,000 years of Jewish persecution led her to become an activist. And through it all, these are folks who are Zionists as well, because they understood all people have to live freely in their land, and the liberation of the Jewish people in our land not only shouldn't come at the expense of the Palestinian people, it should be part of the lifting up and the liberation of the Palestinian people. That's the Zionism that I believe in.
Thank you so much. So we are running a little bit over time, so please can you keep the question as succinct as possible? I am going to allow that.
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am Sadiqa Reynolds. I live in Kentucky, and I want to say thank you to Linda, because I've actually seen you physically put your body on the line and life on the line for freedom for so many. And to John and Linda, I asked the question, really maybe all of you actually, I asked the question about how we bring together leadership, especially in America. We certainly have differences, we certainly have challenges, but what do we do moving forward to alleviate some of the tensions that we see and feel between leaders who may slightly disagree about some strategies, but definitely align on the outcomes? If you could help us with that.
I'll start quickly. I believe that unity is not uniformity. That's what I believe. I don't believe that if we went around and asked people in this room all of their positions on different issues, that we were all going to come out and we're going to be 100% in agreement. And the expectation that we are in movements for justice where everybody agrees is not reality. And I organize from that place. Me and Rabbi Jonah, there are 90 things that we agree on, and there are 10 things we don't agree on. But as long as we are going to find common ground in movements for justice for the communities we come from, against white Christian nationalism and white supremacy in America, we're going to find the work and the way to do that. I think that we require courage. People don't want to have courageous conversations. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. People don't like to hear the truth, and people don't want to speak to each other about the truth. And we just got to stop being sensitive in the movement. You know, the Sadiqa people are sensitive in the movement. People don't want to get their feelings heard. This is not about your feelings. This is not about you getting your feelings heard. There are people who are dying in our communities around the world. There are people who are struggling, people who are trying to survive in our countries. And it's not about who we are as personal leaders. And I hope one thing we leave here today thinking about, as we are all, labeled leaders, which is why LeJune brought us here, it's not about me. I never think it's about me. And I think about the people that are behind me, the people that are in my communities that count on my voice every single day. I'm sure many of you come from communities where people count on you. And guess what? Sometimes your leadership, if leadership was easy, everybody would be a leader. That's what I always tell people. And so for me, my leadership has been challenged. My leadership has been demonized. But you know what? It doesn't bother me, because I need to be a leader for my people. And I want to be an example, just like you are, Sadiqa, for Black women across the country. I'm going to be a leader for young Muslim girls around the world, young Palestinian girls around the world. And so for me, these are the kind of courageous conversations I want to have. I don't want people to ever shy away and say, this is a conversation that, not in this conference, not in that space. Have the conversation, because the reason why America is where it is because we don't want to have courageous conversations. And we're too busy making people feel comfortable. Everybody, don't say this because this person's going to get a little upset. This one's feathers are going to be ruffled. Ruffle every feather. If that leaves all the birds featherless, that's what we have to do in order to get where we need to get to.
If I could just join in us and maybe ruffle a couple of feathers. And I know we're over time. A few things. So I was in Africa when Albie Sachs had the car bomb. I was in Africa when Steve Biko was killed. So Linda, one thing I would say is that even though I'm older, I'm not that removed from the front line. When I say that we need a world where everyone belongs, it's not because I'm sitting in an ivory tower. It's because, so when King, who no one could say was on the front line, insisted that we have a beloved community, it's not because he was removed, it was because he was close. That's right. Yes. And so I want to push us some. And I actually think, for a whole bunch of reasons, that if we just stay in our categorical identities, which you spoke to, we actually can't solve this problem. And what I hope we can get at a future conference, where Rip and Jonas can actually speak about the Palestinian harm and pain, and Linda can speak about the Jewish harm. I mean, I appreciate what you said, but you spoke about it from a particular perspective, which is understandable, because we're not giving up our identities, but we actually are broadening it. And so to recognize, I mean, I must say I winced a little bit. Right now, there's a fight in India, and the Indians and Modi is saying the Muslims are interlopers. They just got there 1,500 years ago. They're new in the country. They don't belong. So how far do we go back? And so it's not enough to say 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. No, the first people who suffered were not the Jews. China, which I work in, is a country that existed uninterruptedly for 5,000 years. Don't forget them. Don't forget Native Americans. So yes, tell your story, but you have to connect it to other stories. And so part of loving everyone, and we have our friend here who's written about love, is that there are no strangers. There are no strangers. And part of the role of leaders is to make that bridge, and that's what Nelson Mandela did so powerfully. When Soweto was rioting because of having to learn Afrikaner, Nelson Mandela was asking his keepers, his imprisoners, to teach him Afrikaner. He was asking, not just he's going to learn the language, he wanted to learn about the people who were enslaving him, the people who were imprisoning him. He was talking about love. So love, to me, is not like a convenience you have when you're comfortable. You have to have it all the time. Amen. And it is a struggle.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you once again to the panelists, and we'll turn it back to our MC.
Thank you so much.